considering both adolescents and parents and the implications for support. I must be able to navigate. So this is an overview of the session. There are approximately 50 slides, so I try to keep up a nice tempo to get through all the slides in the time that is allocated for this webinar. But I will be presenting both from the perspective from my own research and also a little bit from the research literature. So you can, of course, ask questions in the chat, and especially at the end of the presentation, we will have a few minutes for questions and answers and discussion. The papers that have been published on the research that I will be presenting are available, so you can send me an email or contact PAFRA Secretariat. They can also forward your requests to me. And at the onset of this webinar or the presentation, I also wanted to acknowledge what is now called lived experience of suicide and suicide bereavement, because not only looking at my own life or my own experiences, but also experiences from colleagues, both in Australia and internationally. We know that many people who are working in this field or have an interest in this field also have some personal or professional experiences with suicide and suicide bereavement. And for several of us, it's also an important part of our motivation, why we are involved in this field or why we are staying involved in this field. And it's an issue that we do not discuss a lot. But I wanted to acknowledge this also at the onset of this presentation. So a bit of background. Suicide and suicide bereavement are major public health problems. The World Health Organization estimates that there are approximately 700,000 suicides per year globally. In Australia, there are more than 3,000 suicides a year, and the average suicide rate in Australia is around 12 per 100,000 inhabitants, which is a bit higher than the global average. On the screen, you can also see two documents, which I wanted to mention because they entail an important evolution in my perspective, and that's the plea for the inclusion of people with lived experience of suicide in the design of studies, but also in the design of services and service delivery and evaluation and research with regards to service delivery and effectiveness of post-pension services. And I think it's an important evolution because it will, or hopefully will, allow us to design services and interventions in a way that they are more adequately addressing the needs of the people who are in need of the support, and may also provide more useful outcomes or more useful evaluations that may inform further services and policy developments. And I think it's certainly a very important evolution, not only in Australia, but internationally. From the literature, we know that experiencing the death of a close person is a relatively frequent event in the life of adolescents. And the literature states that approximately 4% of adolescents have lost a parent, and about 78% have lost a relative or a friend before the age of 18. From a systematic review and meta-analysis that we conducted a few years ago, we found that about 1 in 20 adolescents have lost someone by suicide in a given year, and about 1 in 5 adolescents do so at some point before they reach adulthood. And we thought that these findings from the meta-analysis was quite important because it indicates that if you have a group of adolescents, for example, 100 adolescents from a school or from a particular city or from sports clubs, then about 5 of those 100 adolescents will have lost someone by suicide in a given year. And about 1 in 5, about 18 on average, would have lost someone before they reached the age of 18. So this is quite a substantial number of adolescents that are confronted with a death by suicide. And with regards to service delivery, especially service delivery in the perspective of bereavement support, very often adolescents are an overlooked population. A note at the side, of course, is that not everyone who is exposed to a suicide, the literature indicates that approximately or up to 135 individuals can be exposed to one suicide on average. But of course, not everyone who is exposed to a suicide will be in need of professional services or professional support. So on the screen, you can see a figure which represents the model of the continuum of exposure to suicide. And according to that model, you have a large number of people who are exposed to suicide, but it's only a smaller inner circle, those who are more closely related to the person who has died, who may be experiencing very intense and severe grief reactions, both on a short term and a long term, with increased risk of mental health complications. Those are the ones that may be in need of professional interventions. And that number is estimated between 5 and 20, depending on the study, depending on the sources in the literature. Important when we examine grief, when we do research on grief, it's important to remember that grief primarily is a natural reaction to a loss of a close person, and that grief includes many common grief reactions, such as, for example, crying, feelings of sadness, guilt, longing, other feelings, anger, for example, and that there are also, in addition to these common grief reactions, also some grief reactions that may be more pronounced, but not necessarily unique to suicide bereavement. Feelings of shock, anxiety, anger, self-blame, rejection, abandonment, feelings that have been reported both in young people, in adolescents, as well as in adult populations. Individuals bereaved by suicide very often also struggle more with why questions, why it has happened, and also with if I had done this or that, then the suicide would not have happened, is also something that is very or more specific in people bereaved by suicide, also in young people bereaved by suicide, as well as struggles with meaning making. People bereaved by suicide, also young people, adolescents, are likely to receive less social support after the bereavement compared to people who have been bereaved by other causes of death. And this lack of social support can be observed either on a short or a long term, and it can be related to characteristics of the bereaved individuals themselves or characteristics in the social environment. And very often when you read about suicide bereavement or when you hear presentations at conferences, then very often you will notice that lack of social support is often mentioned in the context of stigma to suicide. I hope during the presentation to refer to that statement a few times because especially with regards to young people, I think that the stigma that may exist around suicide is less important for young people compared to adult populations, and that there are some specific features in the experience and the life stage of adolescents that are more important than stigma of suicide per se. But I will try to explain during the presentation. The literature indicates that there are short-term increased risks associated with suicide bereavement, especially increased risks of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal ideation, which have been frequently, in many studies, reported. So it's kind of a robust finding that has been established for a few decades now. The literature also indicates that there are long-term risks associated with suicide bereavement in young people, especially with regards to increased risk of depression and related mental health problems, which have been observed up to a few years after the loss. And the literature also consistently reports on increased risks of suicidal behavior in people bereaved by suicide, also in adolescents bereaved by suicide, with estimated increased risk of 2 to 3-fold increase of risk. However, we also know that the risks are, of course, not found in the same, say, the same intensity or the same increasing risks in each individual. And there are a number of factors that affect the risks that are associated with suicide bereavement in young people. And there are, of course, some psychological factors, such as how bereaved adolescents experience and respond to the loss, how they process the grief, how they cope with the loss, how they perceive the impact of the loss on their lives. But there are also a few important contextual factors that have an impact on how the suicide bereavement may affect the grief and the mental health of young people. And roughly we can divide those factors in pre- and post-loss characteristics. With regards to the features that can be observed or have been reported in research that are already existing before the loss, the most important probably is the emotional, psychological closeness that the adolescent had with the person who has died. And the literature indicates that this emotional and psychological closeness is strongly associated with the levels and the intensity of the grief, with the onset of psychiatric problems such as depression and anxiety after the loss, and also with increase of suicidal communications and suicidal ideation in bereaved adolescents. Mental health is another very important pre-loss condition that has an impact on the grief of adolescents bereaved by suicide. And the literature indicates that personal and family mental health history is related to onset of psychiatric problems in bereaved adolescents, and that especially personal history of mental health problems in adolescents is associated with long-term mental health problems in bereaved adolescents. And this is reported both in adolescents who are bereaved by suicide as well as by other causes. And in the interviews that I have done with adolescents bereaved by suicide, they also are aware of this phenomenon, and if they have been struggling with mental health problems before the bereavement, either themselves or in the family. During interviews, adolescents were very well capable of explaining how these mental health issues kind of rolled over the bereavement, and sometimes increased because of the bereavement, because of the escalation of the emotional stress that was put on them through the bereavement. A few important features that are reported after the bereavement that affect impact of suicide on adolescents. Firstly, social support. Social support is reported beneficial for many issues with regards to processing bereavement, with regards to decreasing feeling of loneliness, for example, also having beneficial effects on personal growth. It also has beneficial effects potentially on helpful attitudes, perceiving suicide as preventable, which may be also related to help seeking in adolescents. But there are also a few potentially negative aspects reported with regards to social support in adolescents bereaved by suicide. And one is, for example, that they may also strengthen negative attitudes towards suicide perceiving as a selfish act. And the literature also reports on mechanisms of co-rumination. And co-rumination in this context can be understood as an intense exchange of negative emotions and negative experiences between peers. And these negative exchange can be so strong that there is no room for the exchange of positive experiences or positive feelings, and the focus on these negative emotions and negative feelings can prolong the grief, so can strengthen the grief reactions rather than finding some solace or some comfort that may otherwise be offered by social support. And I think it's especially important to keep this in mind with adolescents, certainly with adolescents bereaved by suicide, that there are several and many potentially positive effects of social support. So it's certainly worthwhile enhancing social support, but we must also be aware that there are some potentially negative aspects associated with social support as well. And then, of course, quality of remaining relationships is an important feature that may help or may not help adolescents bereaved by suicide. And the literature reports that higher functioning of remaining parent, especially after a parent has died, is a protective factor for adolescents bereaved by suicide. It helps them coping, it helps them with processing their grief, and is also protective with regards to mental health complications. And this has been reported in regards to bereavement by suicide as well as by other causes. And interestingly, the literature also reports on what is called a pre and post-loss dose response effect, indicating that the more adolescents are exposed to these pre and post-loss characteristics, the more likely they may also attempt suicide because of the accumulating effect of the different features in their grief or in the context of their grief. The most important implications that I got out of this, out of the literature, is that we should not consider suicide bereavement as an isolated event in the lives of adolescents, but that we should always look at the relational and the mental health context, and also being aware that sometimes the pre and post-loss features are actually more important than the cause of death in itself, because of the weight of mental health that may already be available or existing in the lives of adolescents, pre-existing problems that they may have experienced can have a very strong impact on how they process their grief after suicide. At the same time, I think it's also important to remember that irrespective of risk factors that may be associated with suicide bereavement in adolescents, it doesn't mean that suicide bereavement in itself must be more severe or more pathological than other bereavements that adolescents may experience. And when I present for adolescents, or when I present for parents, for example, I also want to emphasize this, that they must also maintain a perspective of hope. It's not because the literature talks about increased risks of depression and anxiety and suicidal behavior that their adolescent will experience or must experience or cannot cope with depression or anxiety in addition to their grief. A few questions for considerations. I know we don't have the time to discuss these questions now during the presentation, but I just wanted to show them as some food for thought, and maybe later we can have a discussion about it if time allows, or feel free to contact me afterwards. Here, I wanted to briefly talk a little bit about a study that I conducted a few years ago, a study aiming to explore grief, mental health, and help-seeking experiences of adolescents who had lost a family member or a friend through suicide or other causes of death. And it was a qualitative study based on semi-structured interviews. So the participants were young people, adolescents, who had lost someone when they were between 12 and 18 years old, and they participated in the study between 6 months and 10 years after the bereavement. So, and the sample was 39, including both young people who had lost someone by suicide, and young people who had lost someone through another cause. So these are the topics that we discussed during the interviews about the grief, about the death that had occurred, the grief experiences, the circumstances, changes that had occurred in their lives after the bereavement, and issues that helped them or hindered them with coping in their bereavement. And so from the qualitative analysis, we had a few important themes that were identified. And the first important theme that we found was that adolescents reported a lasting impact, not only short-term impact, but a lasting impact of the bereavement on their lives. Feelings of sadness and anger were common, but also feelings of relief and gratitude after the bereavement. Relief because the suffering of the person had ended, gratitude because they had known the person who had died. And very often the person who had died was an immediate family member, was a parent, a sibling, a grandparent, an uncle, an aunt, sometimes a friend. But most of the people who had died were immediate family members in this sample. The impact was both with regards to grief and mental health, and irrespective of the cause of death. And interestingly, in the interviews, adolescents easily identified themselves emotional and psychological closeness as an important factor that affected the impact of their bereavement. So when they had experienced more than one loss, for example, they were very capable of saying, look, this loss of my father, for example, or the loss of my brother or my sister was more severe, was more intense than the loss of another family member or the loss of a friend, because of the relationship that I had with these persons. So they were very capable of explaining this. The second major theme that came out of this analysis, we labeled it grieving apart together, because it identified the relational aspects that we found in the bereavement. And the first aspect was about selective sharing with peers and family. It was actually very striking that almost all the participants in the study would say things as, I would share my grief, I would share my emotions, I would talk with someone, with this particular parent. For example, I will share my grief, I will talk with my mother, but I will not talk with other family members. Or I will talk with this particular friend, but I will not talk with anyone else about my grief or my mental health concerns or feelings. And also in the interviews, they could very well explain the reasons why they would talk with this particular person and not with the others. And very often it had to do with the quality of the relationship, the trust that they placed in this particular person, the connection that they felt, the safety in the relationship that allowed them to share with this particular person and didn't want to share with other people. They also mentioned it sometimes as teenager-related behavior, but at the same time, they also expressed very high and strong levels of self-reliance. So during the interviews, very often they talked about how they wanted to manage themselves. And they said things like, I'm not waiting for an adult or a parent or a teacher to come to me and tell me what I should do. I'm old enough, I am able of looking after myself, and I will deal with it, I will solve it myself, even if they were 13 or 40 years old, and if it was the first experience that they had with that, the first experience with suicide, so that they actually did not have any clues what it was and how they could deal with it. Even then they would say, I'm old enough and I will deal with it myself, and I don't need the adults to come and tell me what I should do. At the same time, they also showed lots of considerations for other grieving relatives. They would say, look, don't bother about me. And at the same time, willing to support and willing to care, for example, a bereaved parent or a bereaved sibling. even if that would entail that they would not receive the support that they would need themselves. So they would rather look after their sibling or their parent than that the parent would try to support them. In the same topic about grieving apart together, there was also lots of evidence about the continuing bond that they maintained with the deceased. It's a bit maybe beyond the scope of the current webinar, but I certainly wanted to mention it as well, because it was a very particular feature in their grief experience that they wanted very often maintain this connection, this bond, which was very meaningful to them to maintain the bond with the deceased. And all this happened both in adolescents bereaved by suicide and adolescents bereaved by other causes. Personal growth was another major theme that came from this analysis. And in the adolescents, they very often, they didn't talk about personal growth as such, but they talked more in the context of life lessons that they had learned from the whole experience from being bereaved by suicide or by other cause of death. And it was often related to increased awareness of the fragility of life, stronger appreciation of life and relationships, and increased maturity. And the increased maturity was sometimes also an issue in sharing or not sharing their experiences with others, because, for example, they would say in their school or in their circle of friends, they were the only ones that had experienced the bereavement, only ones that experienced the suicide. So the others could not understand them. And they felt that they had grown up much quicker and much stronger as well than their friends, than their classmates. So they considered the others more or less as children while they were already growing up, which was also a reason for not sharing their experiences with their friends, for example. And then there was also lots of evidence with regards to increased self-care in adolescents, and this was actually more pronounced in adolescents who had experienced a death by suicide. And self-care with regards to their own mental health, their suicidality, their suicidal ideation, to the extent that we thought that experiencing a death by suicide for this particular group could also be catalytic for positive mental health because of the awareness that they had about mental health and suicide issues. And some participants during interviews stated things like, it stopped me from killing myself, for example, or making comments about what they wanted to do with their life. And said that, like, I don't want to end like my father, for example, who killed himself. I want to do something else with my life. So that it actually was used as a catalytic experience. What was helpful for these participants, lots of things, friends, family, doing something, distractions, pets, sometimes professionals. Interestingly, there was lots of evidence in these interviews that distractions for these participants, for the adolescents, were as useful as sharing their experiences with this particular parent or with this particular friend. And we found this actually very an interesting finding, because it very much aligns with what has been described in the dual process model of coping with bereavement. And according to the dual process model, people bereaved by suicide will oscillate between confronting their grief and sharing their grief, and focusing on other issues like future-oriented issues away from the grief. And bereaved individuals process their grief by oscillating between the two spheres. And we found this as well in these adolescents, which also indicated that the adolescents or the friends or the family members with whom the bereaved adolescent doesn't want to share their grief or their mental health are equally important for processing the grief as the ones with whom they share their grief, because the oscillation is an essential part of processing the grief and being focused on the grief and focusing on something else is equally important. So this was actually a very interesting finding from our study. With regards to professional help, maybe not surprisingly, they had little knowledge about what is available. They perceived it that this is not available to them or not applicable to them. And if they had experiences with professional help, then it was very often very mixed experiences, from very negative to very positive. But if they had been referred to professional help, referrals were mostly done by parents, which is also not unusual, I guess, in this context. With regards to online support, there were lots of mixed experiences, which was a bit of a surprise, I'd say, because you would expect that they would like to use online resources or apps, but in fact, participants indicated that they would prefer much more personal contacts, in-person contacts, than online contacts. And also with regards to school support, there were lots of mixed experiences, but there was some things going on with how adolescents perceived, for example, school counselors. We had the impression that very often they did not perceive school counselors as clinicians, but rather as teachers. And so there were lots of doubts about confidentiality, for example. So a few questions for consideration from this study. Again, we can discuss these things further at the end of the presentation. So implications from the study: we need to provide lots of different types of resources for bereaved adolescents. The ones on the screen have been mentioned by themselves in the study. But as adolescents also say, it's not because the support is available that they will use it. It's still something that they want to decide themselves, whether they want to access it, whether they want to make benefit of it or not, despite what others might think about it. I will skip this from the webinar. This is another study that is actually building on the study that I just presented. In the previous study, we included only the adolescents themselves, bereaved by suicide and other causes. In this study, we also included parents of bereaved adolescents, and trying to see if the experiences and the perspectives of what adolescents report, are they also reported by the parents? Are there any similarities in, for example, or are they complementary to each other? So we recruited adolescents and parents, and we collected the data through semi-structured interviews and also through focus groups. So we had about 20 adolescents in the study and 18 parents. Interestingly, all the parents were mothers. We did not, despite lots of efforts to recruit fathers as well, we did not recruit fathers, we only recruited mothers in the study. There may be good reasons for, which we can also discuss at the end of the presentation. And so the qualitative analysis resulted in 3 main themes. The first theme was the death is a life-changing experience. The death differentiates you from your peers, and the death impacts on the family system. So with regards to death as a life-changing experience, there was lots of evidence that the death by suicide or other traumatic death certainly was a novel experience for adolescents, occurred suddenly, unexpectedly, and had an immediate emotional impact on the adolescents. Adolescents and as well the parents in the study thought that the death, experiencing a death, also affected the identity of the bereaved adolescents. For example, when they lost a parent, they would question if they had become a sort of half an orphan, for example, or if they had lost a sibling, they would ask, am I still a brother? Am I still a sister? So it kind of affected who they were. It affected their identity. And they also found both parents and adolescents that experiencing the death of a close person, such as a parent or a sibling, had a much more stronger impact than the death of a person from external family or from friends. Importantly, both parents and the adolescents described the bereavement as an additional challenge to the life of the adolescents, because adolescents are already struggling and coping with family, with friends, with school, with relationships, and the bereavement by suicide or other traumatic death was experienced as something additional that they had to cope with, an additional challenge to their life. With regards to long-term negative and positive impacts that they experienced and reported in the study, they talked a lot about the importance of triggers and triggers that could occur even several years after the loss. Because we included in the study adolescents or young people who had experienced a loss up to 10 years, so they were between 6 months and 10 years after the bereavement. And so the triggers would occur even several years after the bereavement and would pull them back in the acute grief reactions that they had experienced immediately after the bereavement, which for some of the adolescents implied that, or they became to realize that the bereavement that they had experienced would always be with them, would always stay with them. It would never go away. It was a kind of a lifelong experience that they had obtained through the suicide. They also reported on lasting positive effects, mostly with regards to personal growth, increased personal strength, importance of interpersonal relationships, and appreciation of life. Interestingly, in this context, the parents, the mothers, also reported that some of their adolescents, the bereaved adolescents, may have become too empathic for others rather than for themselves, so that the bereaved adolescents would be much more sensitive and empathic and supportive for their friends, for example, or for family members, but would be overlooking their own needs. With regards to the second theme, that differentiated them from their peers, both the parents and adolescents reported that adolescents felt very much alone in their experiences and often thought that they were the only ones who had experienced a suicide, that, for example, they were the only ones whose father has died by suicide or a grandparent had died by suicide. And they also noticed that other people start treating them differently. And this was a great concern for the bereaved adolescents because they had a very strong desire to be treated the same as before. For example, many of these adolescents spoke about, for example, how they would like to go to school, just to be able to go to school as a normal teenager, and to be away from home, because at home was associated with the bereavement, with other family members being upset, being in grief, everyone being sad. So they would like to go to school to be a normal teenager. But then at school, they would also be treated differently because the classmates or the teachers would not know how to respond to them being bereaved by suicide. And which was also a reason why they would not disclose their grief reactions with others, because they felt a bit an outsider at that time. So participants felt little understood by their friends, and so they started to conceal their emotions and their grief reactions. As a result, many young people narrowed down their circle of friends. And this, for some of them, this was so strong that they would also withdraw, not only socially, but would also withdraw physically. One of the participants in the study, for example, told how at age, I think age 15, when the father of the adolescent had died by suicide, and as a result, or probably as a result, or partly as a result of the bereavement, also many family conflicts increased to the extent that it became unbearable for the adolescent who left home and went to live for about 6 months with friends about 100 kilometers away from home, just to escape from being overwhelmed from the grief and the distress from others, from family members and friends. So the loss of the family equilibrium was a very important finding from the study, the very strong impact of the bereavement by suicide that the adolescent had experienced, that expanded to the loss of the family equilibrium and the change in the family functioning, the family relationships and family dynamics, which implied that they had to rebuild the relationships and find a way of creating a new family without the person who they had lost. At the same time, there were many, between parents and the bereaved adolescents, many reciprocal worries and struggles on how to support each other, because they were very much aware of the difficulties that either the adolescent or the remaining parent or other siblings were experiencing. Parents very often had to deal with other family members, also with their own grief and with mental health issues that they experienced, to the extent that some of the bereaved adolescents felt overlooked by their parents or by other family members. There were many concerns, especially in the parents, a little bit in the adolescents as well, but mostly in the parents, about health risk behaviors in the bereaved adolescents, and especially with regards to alcohol and substance abuse. And it was actually quite surprising in the interviews how the bereaved adolescents explained how easy it was for them to get access to alcohol and other substances, also illicit substances at age 14 or younger. So parents and adolescents had to negotiate about their relationships and rebuilding the family structure and the relationships, regaining trust in each other, a process that took several years. But I think that the findings from these studies were very important to us, because it's actually one of the few studies, as far as I know, that looked at both the perspective from parents and adolescents on how they have experienced the loss by suicide or other traumatic death and the impact it had on their functioning, and how they had to engage with each other on rebuilding trust and rebuilding a family. I'm looking a bit at the time at the moment. Maybe I should pause the presentation at this stage. There was still another part. Maybe I can very briefly, 2 minutes, go through these slides. It was a Delphi study that we did, also building on the previous findings, in which we included parents, adolescents, and clinicians, looking at what they would recommend as consensus recommendations for helping bereaved adolescents. So, and there were 6 sections in the Delphi instruments about the helping professionals, approaches to support and supporting bereaved adolescents. But we also included statements on providing support and involving others in the support to bereaved adolescents bereaved by suicide and other causes of death. In the study, it were very strong endorsements for the statements that bereavement, but also suicide bereavement specific support should be offered on the long term and on the short term in flexible formats. And also statements that the parents and guardians of adolescents should be offered some kind of support. But interestingly, items that addressed support with regards to, for example, family settings were rejected. So this was not supported by parents and adolescents and clinicians. And also items with regards to online and digital support were not approved, were not endorsed by the participants, contrary to items that talked about in-person, face-to-face support. So these are the issues that I wanted to address during this presentation. Here are a few of the papers that I used while preparing the webinar. So if you would like to receive the copies, let me know. I'm happy to send you PDFs of the published papers, and I'm open for any questions.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for the really insightful presentation on such an important topic. I really like the approach you have used, the thematic analysis and the qualitative approach to help us understand adolescent perspectives more. We do have a couple minutes for some questions